Okay, well, greetings all, and welcome to our first, and at least I think it's our first, engineering showcase. My name is Ron Roy. I'm the head of the Department of Engineering Science. But before we launch into a discussion of what's happening in the department, I'd like to also welcome you to the University of Oxford. We are the oldest English-speaking university in the world, about 850 years old. But that doesn't mean we are behind the times, for we are also one of the most highly ranked universities as well. We are regularly ranked in the top 10 worldwide, and for the past 5 years, we have been ranked #1 by the Times Higher Education, ahead of great institutions like Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and I am pleased to say, Cambridge University. Oxford is a full-featured institution that excels in multiple areas, ranging from the arts and humanities to government to medicine and to the physical sciences and engineering. We are distinguished by a highly personalized system for delivering our program by a small group tutorials, an approach that is rewarding, effective, and expensive to run. We have almost equal numbers of undergraduate and graduate students who come from our 160 countries. Approximately 45% of our student body is international. But enough about the university. You've joined us to see and listen to our best academics talk about their work. Today, we have 3 exceptional colleagues working in compelling areas of engineering. Malcolm McCulloch is here to tell us about his work in advanced energy systems. Eleanor will share her thoughts on biomaterials and technologies for drug delivery. Steve Roberts will tell us everything we ever wanted to know about AI and machine learning. And so let's get started. However, I do have 2 housekeeping matters to address. First of all, be aware that this entire session is being recorded. And secondly, although you are free to use the chat throughout, questions for the speakers will be taken at the end in the Q&A session. So Malcolm McCulloch is an associate professor in engineering science and a group leader of the Energy and Power Group at the University of Oxford. His interests are in the areas related to domestic energy sector, development of user-centric demand-side management technologies, and useful information to enable behavioral change. Previous work led to the spin-out Intelligent Sustainable Energy, of which Malcolm is both a founder and a non-executive director. It has merged into form Navitas Energy Management. In the transport sector, research is ongoing in developing powertrains for electric vehicles, including the development of high efficiency, low weight motors using new materials called a yokeless segmented armature motor. This has resulted in the Oxford spin-out company Yasa Motors, of which Malcolm is a founder. Malcolm was a co-director of the Institute for Carbon and Energy Reduction in Transport, a member of the Oxford Martin School from 2008 to 2013. He is a tutorial fellow of Christ Church College. So Malcolm, I hand it over to you and you can let us know what you're working on.
Thank you, Ron. So this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, I'll be talking to you about some of the work in my group in energy. But before I start I want to talk, in a good Oxford tradition, I always ask the audience an important question. And the first question I want to ask is, which countries are sustainable? And I want you just to have a quick think about how many countries and which countries you think are sustainable. And this is a picture of the group that I have, and it's just important to let you know that a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about is building on the efforts, not just of what I do, but of what my whole group does. So the first question you might ask yourself is, what is sustainable? And for sustainability, I use the simple concept of thinking about capitals, that of planetary capital, people capital, and financial capital. And what I wanted to do was focus on the first 2, which is planetary and social capital. And this graph gives us a really quick introduction and insight as to what is sustainable. We can see on the horizontal axis is the ecological footprint. It's the number of global hectares required per person of that particular country. And if you divide the total amount of land area that's available for ecological services divided by the number of people, your sustainable limit is 2 hectares per person. So on the social side, or the people side of the capitals, is that Human Development Index, although not perfect, does give us a good understanding of what the quality of life is of those particular people. And we can see that 0.8 is basically the where we want to be above in order to do it. So our sustainable area is in this top left-hand zone. And so the answer to my earlier question is 0. And this is a kind of worrying development. And the challenge I see for the 21st century, amongst the other big challenges, to say, how do we actually move this group of people to improve their Human Development Index while not increasing their planetary take? And on the similar thing is, how do we decrease this group of countries so that we decrease their planetary take while not decreasing their Human Development Index? And so what we're saying is that basically these are the two big problems. And in terms of energy, rephrasing this in energy, this is all about how do we give access to high quality energy services to this group of people, and how do we decarbonize that group of people? And the insight that I wanted to start off with, and to me the most important insight, is to say that although these are two separate journeys that we are making, either increasing access or decarbonization, the end point is the same. So therefore, the insights that we learn from one to the other will be the same. And I just want to show you in our work how this comes true. So the first thing I want to look at is to look at the access challenge. And we can say, if you're looking in Africa, in the rural areas, we can see these are where houses have been located. And just to give you a quick understanding, this is what typically the quality of life of those people in that particular places. And typically these are people are looking at living well under the $2 per day. And the question is, how do we provide affordable access to these people? And so what you want to start off with by doing is understanding what is the most low cost forms of generation, so that we can actually provide it most cost effectively. And if you have a look at this is a cost of solar panels per watt over the last few decades. And we can see that there's kind of been two regimes, and there's kind of red zone up to about 2008. The solar panel costs have been decreasing slowly, but surely. And in 2008, we can see that we kind of had a regime change, and the costs have really started to accelerate. And this is basically where the large fabrication plants in China came on board. And we're now getting, a cost where we're looking at less than a penny a kilowatt hour, sorry, a US cent a kilowatt hour to actually provide energy from solar. So solar is clearly going to be the generational source. The slight problem is that when you look at it, it's actually, these are the profiles of when people typically use energy. You can see it's at nighttime. So the question is that we actually have to move the time at which the energy is generated to the time when energy is actually used, and that we use batteries. And one of the key insights we had a look at is to say, well, if you've got batteries, can we rethink the whole way the system is developed? And so what we did is we developed a kind of a new way of thinking about systems, where instead of putting batteries at the central hub, which most people do, we put batteries in the home. And that then allows us to say that the power that we're putting down the lines now only needs to trickle charge the batteries. It doesn't need to supply the main power of the load. The batteries can do that. We use power electronics to compensate the volt drop, so we need a little bit of smarts, but this is becoming much cheaper. And the insight is we can actually use a low voltage line and actually a very thin, small, low cost line, so we can actually significantly reduce the cost of distribution, which actually reduces the overall cost of the system. And the key thing is that we're saying that the challenge about how do we move energy through time and create those temporal shifts actually creates value in spatial design. So let's have a look and see how this actually is implemented. So what we'll do is we have our central station. We have some power electronics, which allows us to convert that power into the required power. And what we do is we create a radial design where basically we have one wire going to each particular one, because we want to manage the power individually. I think this is kind of ironic because of those power electronics. It means now this is actually the smartest grid on the planet, because we can actively control the power to each home. And yet it's serving the poorest people in the planet as well. And that allows them to actually get a high quality service, because you've got the batteries, got a higher resilience. It allows them to have high quality service at an extremely low cost. So this is an example of what the power electronics starts to look like. And this is the lab that we're starting to do the first tests. And we're looking to actually send out the first set of kits out to Kenya later this month, so that we can actually deploy that in field. So that's looking at the access problem. Let's have a look at the decarbonization problem. And the challenge that we have is that basically we've got to convert our our coal-fired power stations using our networks across transmission distribution networks to provide load to the end users. And that's the flow of energy, and with the flow of finances, basically, we power retailers, and they then provide the different services. And so if we start to decarbonize, basically this picture changes to something that looks like this, where we replace that central plant to distributed and decentralized renewable generation. But also we're starting to increase the amount of loads that we have. There's more air source heat pumps, which have been in the news today. There's additional refrigeration and e-mobility coming in. So the electrical loads are actually starting to increase. So the challenge now is to say that we now need to be able to say, how do we increase the effective capacity of the lines, given that we need to move more energy through the system? So as the lines carry more energy, we can basically reinforce them, basically put in larger cables, but you'll soon start to realize that if 90% of the distribution system is underground, can you imagine the traffic jams in every city and town in this country as we basically dig up the roads to replace that? So that's going to be really challenging to do and really expensive. So what you try and do is to say, if we can flatten the peak power, we don't need to change the wires. We can actually minimize it so that basically we can ensure that the existing distribution is fit for purpose for the 21st century. So in order to flatten the peak powers, we still need the same energy, so we need to shift it in time. And you can kind of see an interesting parallel, because now we can say challenge about spatial operation actually provides value in shifting things through time. And so we can see this is the dual of the problem that we had in Africa. The way we've gone about doing that is basically say that we've got to look at not only moving energy through space, but you've also got to move it through time. And through Project LEO, which is Local Energy Architecture, we're actually creating a service where we're providing flexibility services which help the distribution system actually utilize their infrastructure a lot better. And this is an example of where we, for instance, have some generation. This is one of river generation that we have just outside Oxford. And we can see that how we've decreased the generation at a certain time, and that's allowed us to actually increase the river levels by about 5 or 6 centimeters, which acts as a battery. And that then allows us to have some additional output power when we need it. So this allows us to have flexibility in the system in a way that was not envisaged originally. And not only are we looking at this for larger appliances and generation, we're actually working with a whole lot of different local communities to see how can we actually make and enable them to be a lot more flexible. And what we can see is that was an area around in the power system. We're also looking to say what happens with electric vehicles, and to say, as we decarbonize the electric vehicle system, what's going to happen. And this on the work kind of gives us 2 projects that we work on. The first one is actually looking where in the country electric vehicles are already starting to take off. And we can see that this is a graph in Gloucester, that we can say that in Gloucestershire, that by about 2032, over 60% of the vehicles will be electric vehicles. And then nationally, we can see that it's going to take us to about 2036, 2037, that 60% of the vehicles will come through. What's interesting is this is all based on data from the Department of Transport. And what we find is that every quarter when we analyze, these curves are moving to the left rather rapidly. So we think actually this is going to move a lot quicker. The transport, the time that you go through over 50% is probably going to be closer to 2035 we get there. But the challenge is that not every person has off-street parking, so how do you deal with it? And so this is a project we're working with a number of partners, looking to say, how can we use local council car parks, put in charges so that local residents that live close to the car parks can actually park their cars there overnight and charge overnight. So this is now using much more efficient use of space, as well as providing a much better charging infrastructure. So you might say, okay, this is great for the high-income countries and how we decarbonize this. Surely this is a joke for low-income countries. Well, actually, what we found is that we can actually provide electric mobility within low-income countries, specifically around Africa, but mainly around what we call paratransit, which is basically the informal sector where effectively a lot of micro-entrepreneurs run 16-seater taxis, and they effectively provide more than 30% of the journeys in Africa. And by looking at retrofitting those vehicles, we can actually create a lot more value for both those. The payback time to electrify one of these vehicles is less than 2 years. It actually creates benefit to the electricity system and actually accelerates the introduction of renewable energy systems. And so what we can find is we're looking at those synergies, we can actually find an overall system that's actually going to be cheaper to operate electric vehicles of this type in all sub-Saharan countries other than Liberia. The reason Liberia is this kind of outside is because they really heavily subsidize their fuel. And the last example I wanted to give you was to say that, you know, Steve's going to be talking about his AI stuff, but we also do a little bit of AI. And this is basically a project where we're looking at satellite imagery and we're using citizen science to help us identify all the homes that are available in Africa. And so what we do is we use citizen science to actually label each of these different locations. And then we apply some AI, which allows us to use that as a training set to actually look over large quantities. And to give a rough idea, typically, you know, with citizen science, we would be able to transform about 7 square kilometers per day. Using AI, we can do something like 7,000 kilometers per day in terms of analyzing that. And once we've got that, we can then start to use that to actually design grids really efficiently. On the same side, in Oxygen, we're using the same kind of ideas and areas where we are identifying both where generation can be, but we're also using AI to actually identify where things like which homes are most appropriate for local heat systems, or whether they use SRT heat pumps or ground source heat pumps. And so we're working with our local council to actually work out to say where are the best ways to actually provide those low carbon technologies within Oxygen, and to provide a strategic view, then working with the local distribution companies to understand how do we actually provide those robust, flexible grids in those areas where we're going to be hit by that. So that gives us a quick overview of, you know, just a small smattering of the projects that we're involved in. But to look on where we're moving to, it's just to remember the kind of things we need to take account of in all of these is we need to become sustainable, and we need to do that rapidly. The journeys that we have are going to be different, but the destination is going to be the same, and the transition is going to be really exciting and creating new value. And in creating new value, the university is starting to embark on some really exciting projects. The first is we have created a multidisciplinary energy system, energy systems, MSc, where we're educating really amazing young talent to help deliver sustainable energy systems. Quite a lot of those are now going out into following off that with a PhD, and I'd just like to thank, you know, Andrew and Catherine for providing some additional funding to enable those extremely high talent to actually make a difference, and they're focusing particularly in making a difference in the low-income countries. The second thing we're doing is we're building up an Energy Systems Institute, which is basically a strategic injection to build up the capital within Oxford around providing a high level of leadership, addressing these systemic changes for low carbon energy transition. And this is both the introduction of new posts, but also looking at to say how can we get much better activities to join the university up with its external partners, such as companies and NGOs and philanthropy. And then the last exciting one is to say that we're actually looking to building an energy systems accelerator, which is a space of about, will house about 800 people across industry and academia and government. And this is exciting because this is now going to be a building which is really going to enable that linkage between academia and those key actors in the world to actually make a fantastic challenge. And I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thanks, Malcolm. If you could hand your screen over to Eleanor, we can continue. Professor Eleanor Stride is the Biomaterials Chair in the Department of Engineering Science. She has won recognition for outstanding engineering accomplishments in diverse areas. Hang on, you can see. And established herself as a research authority in biomedical engineering, as witnessed by her publications, patents, spin-outs, and engagement, and awards, including a number of international awards and prizes such as the IET-AF Harvey Prize in 2015, Fellowship in the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2017, and the Order of the British Empire in 2021. Her work focuses on biomedical ultrasonics and fabrication of nano and microscale devices for targeted drug delivery. This includes work on advanced encapsulation methods for the fabrication of drug carriers, controlled release, and the biophysics of therapeutic drug delivery. Eleanor has actively advanced the public presentation of engineering in broadcasting, exhibitions, lectures, and videos, and has worked as a most effective advocate in advancing the cause and ideals of engineering. She's a fellow of St. Catherine's College. So Eleanor, I'll hand it over to you now.
Fantastic, thank you, Ron. Assuming no one's telling me you can't see, so I'm hoping that's all clear. So I'd like to start just by explaining a little bit about the motivation behind our work. I'm part of a large team based up near the Churchill Hospital in Headington in the Institute of Biomedical Engineering, and we are trying to develop more effective methods for delivering drugs for treatment of diseases such as cancer and stroke. And the motivation can really be summed up in 3 slides. Or it can when my computer decides to comply. The first is the staggering increase in the investment that's been put into the development of new drugs over the past decade. This is not including COVID figures, I should stress. It's been rising dramatically. It's going to continue to do so. That's not, however, translating into a similar number of new drugs actually making it through into the clinic. It's over the last sort of 20 years or so, it's been bouncing around. Clearly the last year, there will be quite a few new ones, but there's no direct correlation between investment and new products. And perhaps more seriously is the impact on patient well-being on healthcare is not there either. I've selected cancer as an example, but neurological disease and heart disease, very similarly. We're gradually seeing an increase in patient numbers despite this huge technical and financial investment. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. With an increasingly aging population, unfortunately, the prevalence of diseases such as cancer inevitably increases. A lot of the new solutions that we're developing actually are only suitable for a very small number of patients. And as we advance in technology, unfortunately, they also tend to become more expensive, and the number of patients that can receive them is also diminished. In many cases, though, the answer is much simpler. Although we've spent a huge amount of time and effort developing new drugs, we've not really looked at how they're delivered. The vast majority of new drugs are still delivered either in the form of an injection or by pill. There's some innovation in inhalers and patches, but so the vast majority are traditional administration techniques. Now, for a lot of drugs, that's absolutely fine. You do actually want them to be distributed throughout the body. But for the very, very potent drugs that we use, for example, in treating cancer, it is a significant problem. Because once that drug is in the bloodstream, it's distributed throughout the body. All of our tissues get exposed, and less than 1% actually ends up in our target region. This is the reason why cancer chemotherapy causes such significant side effects, because 99% of the drug is being absorbed by healthy tissue. Actually, the problem's worse than that, though. This is a slice taken through a tumour. This was a study done by my colleague, Rob Carlisle, showing where the drug actually ends up when it's in the tumour. So of that 1%, as you can see here, the green is where the drug is ending up. It's all ending up just around the blood vessels within the tumour. It's not making it into the tissue that needs to be treated. And so even that 1% is not going to be very effective. So I titled my talk Engineering Bubbles. Bubbles is one of the things that we are trying to use to overcome this delivery challenge. Now, before any scuba divers in the audience get very, very nervous, you can safely inject bubbles into the bloodstream without causing the bends. And in fact, they've been used successfully in ultrasound imaging for many decades now. What you're looking at here is a video of an ultrasound scan of the liver, and hopefully, zoom resolution allowing, you'll see that the blood vessels start to gradually show up. And the reason you start to be able to see them is that these tiny bubbles are washing into the blood vessels. They're reflecting the ultrasound, and that's what enables you to detect them. And I said tiny bubbles, they are a few micrometers in diameter, so about a 50th of a human hair, and actually smaller than a red blood cell, which is why we can safely inject them without risk of causing any sort of embolism. And the reason they work is because the bubbles are full of gas. When you hit them with ultrasound, the changing pressure causes these bubbles to expand and contract, and they act as tiny sources of sound, and that re-radiated sound field is what we're picking up, and they're incredibly efficient. So say bubbles have been around for quite some time in imaging. We're exploiting exactly the same phenomenon in therapy. So this is an ultra high-speed movie taken in our lab of a bubble oscillating in an ultrasound field at a few million frames per second. This is the fluid around the bubble. So we've added some fluorescent nanoparticles to behave like drug molecules. And as you can see, as the bubble's oscillating, it sets the fluid into motion. It acts like a tiny little pump. And the key thing here is the length scale. So although our bubble is only a couple of micrometers in diameter, it's having this pumping effect over a couple of 100 micrometers. And that's plenty of distance within tissue to actually improve drug delivery. Now, does it work in practice? Well, this is the image I showed a few slides back where we're not being very successful in delivering the drug deep into a tumour. This is what happens when we repeat the experiment, but now we use bubbles driven by ultrasound to pump that drug. As you can see, we're getting much, much better coverage of the tissue, and that translates into a much higher probability of successful treatment. Now, the other fantastic thing about bubbles, and one of the things we focus on in my group, is actually engineering the bubbles themselves. So one drawback of using a very, very tiny bubble is they're not very stable. They tend to dissolve away very, very quickly. So we have to coat that gas core with a shell, typically a biocompatible surfactant, that reduces surface tension and it stops the gas from escaping, so the bubbles can stably circulate around the body. But that shell gives us an opportunity to use the bubble for encapsulating drug molecules. So in addition to that pumping effect, we can use the bubbles to control when and where a drug gets released. Drug stays in the bubble, we can track it using ultrasound at low energies. At the target site though, we increase the energy and then we can release the drug just at the target site, and we can hopefully therefore significantly reduce the amount of drug we need and its absorption in healthy tissue. And we can go one step further, we can actually attach molecules to the surface of the bubble, allowing it to bind at particular sites to increase that targeting effect. So one of the wonderful things about working in Oxford is the number of very research active clinicians that we're able to work with, and we're working in several different areas applying this technology. I want to talk about two in particular. The first is infection, in particular antimicrobial resistance. So as I'm sure most of you will be more than too well aware, antimicrobial resistance really is a very, very significant and rapidly growing problem. We are already seeing huge impact of the fact that many of our antibiotics do not work anymore, and we desperately need new solutions. We've just started a major program grant on this area. It's an area I've been working in for more than 15 years, and we're delighted that finally people are starting to take notice and invest in this. With apologies for striking a very unglamorous note, a very significant problem in antimicrobial resistance is urinary tract infections. This is something that's thought of as quite a trivial problem, really not. There are 30% of patients worldwide actually suffer recurrent infections, and the reason for this is that bacteria become embedded over time in the cells lining the bladder wall, and so when you take a simple course of antibiotics, that drug doesn't touch those bacteria. Simply ineffective. They're washed out and the bacteria grow. Worse than that, every time you give conventional antibiotics, you are slightly increasing the resistance of those bacteria. They're seeing a subtherapeutic dose and they become more resistant, they evolve. So we're trying to see if we can use bubbles to improve penetration and wipe out those intracellular bacteria. So the experiment that we've been doing is we're comparing free antibiotic to a nanoparticle, something that's being trialled various places in the world to address this problem, with our bubbles loaded with the nanoparticles to get this pumping effect. Now, another challenge for us is there actually aren't very many good models for human infection, particularly in the bladder. So we've been working with an amazing team in London at the Royal Free Hospital who've developed a so-called bladder organoid. So these are cells taken from patients, they're grown up into a three-dimensional tissue layer, and we can then infect them with actual patient-derived bacterial samples. So we have something that's much, much closer to human tissue than a lot of, for example, animal models. So this is our test bed. This is what happens when we add our drug-loaded bubbles. We've used a fluorescent green dye here just to show you what happens. With the liposomes, we see some penetration, but it's not very good. We're not getting very much drug into our cells. We see a similar effect when we just add the bubbles, but when we apply ultrasound, we see very, very significant uptake of our drug. Now, does that translate into cell kill? Fortunately, yes. So we're now comparing a conventional dose of an antibiotic, gentamicin, against our drug-loaded bubbles, and the key thing here is the difference in the numbers. So not only do we get a much more significant reduction in the number of bacteria, we're doing it with a tiny fraction of the dose of 200 micrograms versus 0.5 micrograms. So this is very exciting. This is something we're now taking forward with the clinical team at the Royal Free, hopefully into the clinic as soon as possible. The second thing I want to talk about is our work on cancer, and in particular on pancreatic cancer. I think this graph illustrates why, although there have been amazing advances in the treatment of some types of cancer, pancreatic cancer, the prognosis remains very, very poor and has done for the last 60 years. It's a huge challenge for drug delivery. Unfortunately, patients tend to be diagnosed very late when tumours are quite large. As a result, they have a very poor blood supply and consequently very low levels of oxygen, which makes the cancer cells incredibly resistant to almost every form of treatment. And in addition, typically the cancer tends to spread or metastasize, so there will be secondary tumours elsewhere. One of the consequences of that is that patients tend to be unable to tolerate very aggressive chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And so we've been working with a team in Northern Ireland on a type of drug that only becomes active when it's exposed to ultrasound, so-called sonodynamic therapy. And the advantage of that is you can actually inject very high doses, but you only activate it where you focus the ultrasound, so you can minimize toxicity. The flaw, however, is the way the drug works. It produces these reactive oxygen species. These are the toxic free radicals that kill the cancer cells. And to do that, we need to have enough oxygen present for the drug to work. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's lacking in pancreatic tumours. There simply isn't enough oxygen around for the drugs to be activated. So the challenge we were set was, could we create a bubble that we could tag the drug onto the surface of and then fill that bubble with oxygen so that we're providing the drug with its own reservoir when we inject it into the bloodstream. Now, this was not trivial. Oxygen is really difficult to encapsulate. There was a lot of quite advanced chemical engineering, with huge thanks to team members of my group who were absolutely wonderful in doing this. They were relentless. And these were the first set of data that we got. So this is in a pancreatic tumour model. The red line is showing what happens if you don't treat. As you can see, it accelerates growth very, very rapidly, doubles in less than a week. In the absence of any ultrasound, just giving the drug does nothing, the orange line. When we do treat with ultrasound, though, we see we can significantly reduce the tumour size, but the pink line is showing what happens when we do that with a bubble loaded with just air. Not very much happens. When we use our oxygen bubbles, though, we see that we've actually halved the tumour size, and that size reduction has remained over this comparatively short experiment. But this was enough to get our clinical colleagues very excited. To them, this is the difference between being able to treat a patient with surgery or not. However, it was a preliminary experiment. We were injecting directly into the tumour in this case. It was a fairly short experiment. It was a nice, simple model. We were just trying to see what was going on. And then there was a scientific issue, and that was that we didn't know why the drug was working. And this became very clear to us after a paper was reviewed. So the drug is actually based on a much older type of drug, a so-called photodynamic therapy drug, where instead of using ultrasound to activate, you use light. The problem was there was no reason why ultrasound should have the same effect as light. And as a reviewer very kindly pointed out to us, this was the Wikipedia entry. Now, we were a little offended to be described as a quack cancer treatment. And so I had a very, very resilient and persistent PhD student, Estelle Beguin, who made it her mission to work out what was going on and demonstrate that, no, there was some very good science behind this. And amazingly, what she discovered, and we published this a couple of years ago now, was that bubbles, when they're driven with ultrasound, emit light. So this so-called sonoluminescence phenomenon, which is what you're seeing on the screen here. Now, that wasn't a complete surprise. That's been known in chemistry for many years. It wasn't supposed to happen at the sorts of frequencies and the size of bubbles that we use in medical imaging, however. So this was a very exciting discovery. We actually think there's a lot of potential for this in other areas. And crucially, it gave us that hard explanation and a mechanism for our drug activation. Our other challenge, though, was making sure we could get enough bubbles at the target site. And so we added in one more component, and that was some magnetic nanoparticles. Now, the reason we chose magnetic particles over another type of biochemical targeting, I will illustrate with these videos. So these are some bubbles that have been made sticky. We put an antibody on the surface. We're looking at them flowing through a capillary. And as you see, because of that targeting, some of them get stuck to the surface. But if we do the same experiment, we've got a capillary, the bubbles are flowing through, but we've now got a magnet located about 1 centimetre away. Over the same time period, we're able to increase the number of bubbles that we can trap by a factor of several thousand, if not more. So our ability to concentrate the bubbles in our target region is just much, much higher. And indeed, when we repeated the experiment now with a more sophisticated tumour model and we used magnetic targeting, we actually only saw a significant effect with the targeted bubbles. And this was one of the most exciting graphs. This is actually showing the number of tumour cells we've been able to successfully kill with the drug. And we saw this very, very significant effect with the targeted bubbles. So again, this is something we're now working very closely with the clinical team to take forward. I should say something about scale-up. There are many, many examples of curing cancer in mice. It doesn't always translate into the clinic, and actually selecting magnetic targeting has a huge drawback in that the force you can develop from a magnet diminishes with the cube of distance. So proving this works at centimetre scales does not translate automatically. And so I had another fantastic student who, together with a postdoc who was designing magnetic arrays, was able to confirm that this would work on human length scales. So we've stolen some technology from particle accelerators. We have an array of permanent magnets that allows us to produce a region of confinement. And we can align that with our target. So this is just a very simple tube representing a blood vessel and a big block of gel representing tissue. We inject the bubbles, they flow through, hopefully they get trapped by the magnet, and then we're imaging. And this is what we see with the imaging. Bubbles come in, the magnet's sitting down here, and we see them getting deflected down, and this nice build up here showing that we're able to capture a significant portion of the bubbles. Now that was a block of gel. This is my colleague Professor Konstantin Kustios's amazing work on organ perfusion. So this has been developed to enable transplant organs to be kept alive, but it also provides us with a fantastic test bed for testing social technology. So we repeated this experiment, but now instead of in a block of gel, in a real organ. And to our huge relief, and this was about 2 o'clock in the morning, we saw the same thing. We see this nice build-up of white here, showing that we've been able to successfully trap the bubbles with the magnet. Now, before I go, I just want to share some very recent results with you. The one thing I've not addressed is this metastasizing of the tumour, this spreading. And unfortunately, metastases tend to be the tumours that are ultimately fatal. I'm sure you will have been aware of the last 15 years of the extraordinary developments in immunotherapy. So far, this has not been hugely successful, though, in solid tumours, such as pancreatic cancer. And this is a paper we published earlier this year, where we've investigated whether our bubbles can actually stimulate an immune response. So we have 2 tumours in this case. One, the green line that we treat with ultrasound, where we see the effect that we've seen previously. But the really exciting thing is we're actually seeing a response in the other tumour, the one we've not exposed to ultrasound. And that means we've stimulated an immune response that is then attacking the distant tumour. And we've also combined this with an immunotherapy drug, TPD-L1, and seen that that actually has a synergistic effect. We get an even bigger effect on the tumour. All of these curves are for the secondary tumour that we didn't expose to ultrasound. So this is something we've actually started a spin-out company, and we're going to try and get this into the clinic as soon as possible. So with that, I need to thank a huge number of people, both the amazing members of my team, my colleagues in Oxford, but also elsewhere in the UK and internationally. People who very kindly fund our research, and I very much look forward to questions at the end of this session. Back to Ron.
Well, thanks, Eleanor. If you could hand it over to Steve. Steve Roberts is one of the most respected academics in the Department of Engineering Science, as well as a world expert and thought leader in information engineering. He's extremely interdisciplinary, with a first degree in physics followed by a DPhil in machine learning. Excuse me. Steve's main area of research lies in machine learning approaches applied to data analysis for the particular interest in time series analysis and decision theory. His current research applies Bayesian statistics, graphical models, and information theory to a highly diverse set of problem domains that include astronomy, mathematical biology, sensor networks, and quantitative finance. Steve is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Institution of Engineering Technology. He currently holds the Royal Academy of Engineering / Man Group Chair in Machine Learning and is a professorial fellow at Somerville College. So Steve, I'll hand it over to you now.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ron. And just want to say, wow, it's very difficult to follow the incredible talks that we've just heard, which just showcase the bewildering depth of human intelligence with something which is to do with machine intelligence. I fear you're going to find machines pretty shallow by comparison to some of the amazing work that you just heard about. However, there is much to love about the automation in engineering, science, commerce and technology. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, not specifically necessary about some particular projects in my lab, but more generally about the kind of things that we're interested in generally across the whole lab, including work of my good friends and colleagues here in the department. It is not tongue-in-cheek to say that machine learning and AI really is a bewildering array of possibilities. I mean, pretty much everywhere we go, there's no need to tell you about the ubiquity of intelligent algorithms, whether they're helping us plan and create new buildings, whether they're automating various things on production lines, whether they're being used as part of our healthcare protocols, consumer entertaining us, translating for us, even looking at images and sifting through vast image databases, trying to annotate and connotate all the information that we have across the internet. AI has really seared and taken off over the last decade. There are many who might ask the question, is this real? Is it hype? But what I'd like to do is sort of concentrate on some of the areas that I think AI is really having a profound and fundamental, tangible effect in everything that we do, certainly within the Oxford ecosystem and beyond. And I'll kind of kick out by saying AI, in the way we are interested in it, is about data-driven solutions, finding solutions to very complex problems that traditionally we think of as the domain of human experts to find those solutions, but we do that by just looking at large arrays of data. And the vastness of data sets is truly staggering. Some of the things that we have been involved with and are still involved with, for example, turbo machinery like jet engines, 6 terabytes an hour if you're recording absolutely everything from all the telemetry on an engine. In a scientific perspective, the Square Kilometre Array, right now, the world's largest radio telescope is squirting data through its detectors at over 1 terabyte per second. So just staggering to think how much data is being created on a daily basis. Financial markets, this is one of the most roboticized and algorithmic ventures that we have on the planet. Finance has always been highly automated. And right now, of course, we can take snapshots of financial data. This is streaming through at terabytes per hour, being stored and being used to change the way in which companies, nations, and individuals manipulate their trades on global markets. Fueled by that massive data, we're able to drive transformations right across the board. I always joke in the Oxford world that we collaborate from A to Z, from astronomy to zoology, and it is not, it is entirely true. One of the great privileges of working in data-centric engineering is the fact that we can apply our methodologies, sometimes with very little transformation. We can apply those methodologies to pretty much everything. We look at vast scale data sets in things like astrophysics. We apply similar models to the ephemeral stochastics of financial data series, trying to make on-the-fly scrapings of information and make good decisions for our partners in the financial world. We're very heavily involved in the nascent domain of quantum computation. We work in the more traditional engineering domains, such as jet engines. We work in theoretical and methodological component domains, building brand new ways of actually computing with uncertain distributions of data. We work providing a helpful hand to the amazing colleagues, one of whom you've just heard in the healthcare and biomedical world. We work with our colleagues in statistical sciences to bring to bear some of the highest performance computing on the planet. And right the way at the very end, we look all the way to deal with ecology, systems biology, understanding species and despeciation, environmental health at planetary scale and beyond. So the bewildering possibilities of bringing smart algorithms to these vast data sets absolutely is well more than a lifetime of work. On top of all that, if that wasn't enough, we can also strive to be thought leaders regarding the role of AI in society. This is some super work that's come out, the top one to do with trying to understand the role of AI in healthcare, personalized medicine, what could and should be automated in order to make a more streamlined, more effective, and more efficient healthcare system, not just for us, but for people in the developing world as well. And the lower two plots are from my good friend and colleague Mike Osborne and his work with Carl Frey on the automation prospects and what jobs may or may not be automated by AI over the coming years. And I think that engaging some of the discussion around the moral responsibilities that we have when we worry about how automation is going to impact the world around us, from science to travel, to the urban environment, to the finance, to the way in which the world operates at a socio-political level. I think it's really right that we should be engaging fundamentally with all these people as well. One of the areas, of course, sitting squarely within the engineering community is the fact that over the decades, the rise of smart automation has very much driven a drive towards a change in industry. And around about 10 or 15 years ago, we began to move towards this so-called Industry 4.0, where it is very cheap to put telemetry on everything that you do at industrial scale, whether that be big bits of kit in a mining environment or telemetry looking at flow in pipes of a petrochemicals plant, all the way through to the kind of equipment that comes out of industry, like jet engines, automobiles, and the infrastructure of our modern world. And by and large, it's pretty cheap to put this telemetry on. We get this vast sea of data from which we need to distill insight and knowledge. And because these data sets are so very, very large, these exceed human scale of understanding. And we really need to lean on our algorithms to provide us with a distillation of that knowledge so that we can make sense of this very complex telemetry in the world around us. We do this in everything from petrochemicals right the way through to hundreds of tons of equipment moving around in mines, to jet engines and aircraft telemetry, right the way down to engine management units in your family car. And perhaps if you have particular insurers who put telemetry inside your car as part of the insurance deal, we work with them analysing that telemetry and trying to drive prices of your insurance down based on telemetry about the way you drive. And we try and do all this against a backdrop of compliance to do with privacy and the ethics of looking at the way you go about your daily commute. That is not easy, but it is one of the showcase areas where AI is really having a profound impact in the engineering community. And it's not just engineering and technology. I think that we're now seeing an era of what I've called Science 4.0, where we have big scientific data and we're creating big automated science. Pretty much all science is now done in the data. Experiments are a method to record data, and then we start doing the science within that data. Whether that's in radio astronomy, whether it's optical astronomy, whether it's geospatial seismology, whether it's particle physics, to name just a few things in the physical sciences, let alone the biological sciences, the role of AI is very profound to try and sift through this sea of data and help us as human beings identify new phenomena and test to the limit our understanding of the known laws of physics. And by and large, in the physical sciences, and to a greater extent now in the life sciences, those AI innovations are fueling this automation in science around areas of detection and discovery, what I call prophecy physics, looking at data and coming up with laws of physics, human in the loop, and Malcolm mentioned earlier the use of citizen science. This is a really critical perspective of getting things like training data and using that to kickstart algorithms, and the role of smart experimentation. If I give a few examples of those, we've been working over the last 15 years on data, for example, from the Kepler Space Telescope for the last 13 or so years. Really what we're doing, if you're an engineer, we're kind of condition monitoring. We're looking for anomalous things out there in luminosity curves of stars and trying to find planets around other stars. There are thousands upon thousands of these really exciting new discoveries that are still being made on a daily basis. They're not being made by astronomers. They're being made by science teams in conjunction with smart algorithms that are imbued with the knowledge of what the luminosity curves of real stars should look like and look for the characteristic blips of orbiting planets. We can use these ideas to then screen data to look for new potential ways of understanding the universe around us. We have algorithms that automate Newton's laws of motion. Most importantly, looking at apples falling from trees, we not only can infer Newton's laws of motion, but we can also infer and automate the process of discovering things like the principles of conservation of energy, things like the principles of conservation of momentum. And armed with this, we can start to look more broadly at the physical sciences and the way in which those come into play in technology, in particular in the engineering community. There's many of us also taking these ideas and moving away from physics-informed AI to say, what does finance-informed or economics-informed AI look like? What are the laws of economics we can learn? What does environmental or ecology look like when looked at with AI? We can use human intelligence in symbiosis with our AI to accelerate the scale at which we can get really important human-centric knowledge and to bring that curation and compliance that only people have into the kind of projects that we look at. And most importantly, and I think most excitingly, we can use these ideas in a feedback mechanism to constantly be looking at our current experimentation and our knowledge, to build a surrogate model of what we know about the world and propose new experiments, roboticize those experiments, run them, and feed those back into our model. Right now, we're running this on everything from drug discovery, right the way through to new material discovery, and ways in which we can do things like calibrating quantum computers. This is the scientific feedback principle, the scientific principle embodied within mainstream AI, and it can be done 24 hours a day at a rate that people simply can't perform this. The kind of things that we really pioneer here in Oxford, myself and colleagues, right the way across the board, language, image signals, machine learning at scale, whether it's detecting objects in huge image databases, using image and sonar and sensors to create the world's finest self-driving cars, to build the very best ways in which we can combine information in large-scale sensor networks to make shipping, to make autonomous vehicles, to make urban centres far more efficient and safe for everybody. We also go further than that in intelligent systems. I do beg your pardon, I've gone over a couple of slides there. We look at quantum computation, we look at huge graphs, networks and interactions, their topology, and the way interconnected things within the world interplay with one another, and the dynamics of these kind of interactions. The way these interact with numerics, stochastic analysis, the way in which we can work with our friends and colleagues in mathematics, and most importantly in areas like computational fluid dynamics, another area in which the department really excels, to go beyond finite element methods, to build better surrogate models for what fluid flow might look like in huge scale devices. Working with friends and colleagues across the board in computer science, we use AI for everything from healthcare, ontologies, understanding the ways in which you can automate the querying of the vast knowledge store that we have on the internet, right the way through to cybersecurity and how we use these approaches in order to provide information to the legal system and provide policy information through to our politicians. These things don't come without challenges, and I think there's common threads in these challenges. One of the challenges is beyond human scale knowledge extraction, and how you do that to send that knowledge back to us as human beings. Everything from radio astronomy through healthcare to understanding the natural world and energy systems to climate and beyond. This creates data at planetary scale that is beyond the capacity for any of us as human beings to understand. We need algorithms to sieve this, yet sometimes we don't know up front what it is that we're looking for. And imbuing algorithms with the smartness to sift this data correctly and not lose that value is very, very challenging indeed. On a more engineering and technical basis, we need to use these algorithms in order to convert the huge scale computation that we have at our fingertips into something which is effective and energy efficient as well. I don't need to tell you about the headlines about how many commutes or flights across the Atlantic large-scale training of AI models does. It is a damaging focus on the environment. So AI itself and the training of these huge models uses energy of computation, and this is becoming a really significant problem as we move to an era to have more compute efficient and green AI. And we need to build far better models for computing under uncertainty. Algorithms are fabulous at coming out with numbers. The answer is 42, but without a context of knowing exactly what the question was, or knowing, if you like, what the error bars are and the shades of uncertainty and the fog of ignorance, that number we may act upon as human beings, believing our computers are correct, because that's what we tend to do. Yet computation is an inherently trustless regime of human activity, and we need to give our computers the ability to better compute with true uncertainty so that they calibrate our expectations about the correctness of the answers they provide for us, helping us use or not use the answers that they give, and for us to make the right decisions on the basis of real knowledge, not fake knowledge. And I think that we need a lot more research on the ways in which these ultra-dense, deep models like deep learning are used in the world around us, how they work well, but most importantly, where their failure modes are. And in safety critical systems, understanding how the failures take place in the corner cases is probably more important than understanding how the vast majority of correct interpretations take place. Autonomy at scale. Envisaging a world in which everything is connected in many ways, a world of constantly interconnected, dynamically making and breaking connections in the cyber physical reality that we are rapidly approaching. Urban environments where everything from earthquake dampers on buildings right the way through to understanding swarms of drones that are going out and looking at the environment for us, to the ways in which self-driving cars are taking us from place to place, and sensor networks are absolutely embedded in the fabric of our society. We still are yet to really understand how the right way to do this is at scale. And complex systems from quantum right the way through to the incredibly complex, combinatorially complex systems to do with everything from social networks, human interaction, and global financial markets. Computational mathematics, really building better surrogates and using AI to interrogate those so we get better upfront understanding about how we feed that back to the design process. Why is it that some turbine blades in jet engines fail prematurely? What was that about the usage? Is there anything we can learn about the manufacturing and use this as part of a feedback mechanism in an incredibly complex data-rich environment to help create better and indeed drive towards fault-free manufacturing by using the kind of lifetime data that we have about these machines? So Let me start concluding now and just talk a little bit about the research challenges. I think no prizes for guessing. The first one is scalability. The vast amount of data that we deal with, which sit on at exabyte, petabyte to exabyte. Exabytes pretty much around a decade ago would be most of the available hard disks that we would have, say, in the UK. We are now dealing with data sets which could easily fill up an exabyte in a day of use. Actually dealing with that data, both as sequential data, but as a single monolithic data set, is a challenge beyond our knowledge right now. Second challenge is creating verifiable systems, systems which give safety critical functionality to the way in which we do learning, which give formal guarantees about the correctness of the algorithms and the way those algorithms deal with the data and the decisions that come out of it, even at scale, even with uncertainty, and even with the vast array of complexity that we see in the world around us. We do have the ability, and one of the beautiful things about Oxford is the connections between ways in which we work and the new ways in which we will be working in the future. I've just quoted a couple of them: probabilistic programming, where we deal with every computation as inherently an uncertain event. You want to invert a matrix, this is not a deterministic. You only get something to machine precision. Quantum systems are even more ephemeral, and we are privileged to have some of the finest minds in the world working on quantum computation with us. And finally, and absolutely not least, we need to be thought leaders in the ethics of information. We need to worry about fairness and bias, compliance and ethics and regulation. And these must be embedded centrally within the algorithms that we build, and not just added as an afterthought in order to meet some kind of recommendation or regulation. Algorithms themselves must know about ethics, they must know about the outcomes of numbers that they create and the decisions that may be taken thereof. However, with all of these things, let me put a really big positive spin. Why Oxford? Oxford not only is a hotbed of innovation when it comes to some of the spin-outs, university research that's accelerated and scaled to global level by a whole bunch of incredibly high-profile spin-outs, but at a raw academic level in this subject alone, in the AI sphere, at the biggest venues, things like NeurIPS, our biggest showcase event for AI across the world, Oxford last year surpassed Facebook and DeepMind to be the top university worldwide with impact and papers within this prestigious conference. And I think that's absolutely incredible, given that we have probably around about 1,000th to 100,000th of the raw resource that many of these large companies have in terms of people, but most importantly in terms of resources, financing and compute resources. Why the UK? Again, it is a privilege to work here. We simply are the hub at European level. And I think the challenge that we have is making sure that we compete at global level with, in particular, North America and with China. So let me end there and leave you with our thoughts about the future. Automated system can right now review data, extract meaning and find explanations at scales that we can only dream of. I should point out, for those of you who are alums of the department, this is meant to be Albert Einstein. I showed this picture and one alum said, "Is that Basil Kouvaretakis? He taught me Fourier transforms in my second year." It is not Basil, but it is an equally august, great person, which is a fake Albert Einstein. Thank you all very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Stephen. If I could have my screen back for a minute. Slides are fairly self-explanatory, and all the information that I would relay verbally is pretty much presented on the slides themselves. So this is the introductory slide, obviously, where I point out that we're a general engineering department, both in terms of our research, but also in terms of our undergraduate programs. This slide basically allows you to take a look at the essentially demographics of the department by numbers, the number of academics we have, undergraduates, graduate students, and so on. It's a very large department, and we're basically organized in 7 different research clusters as shown over here. Each of these clusters is sort of like a sub-department of sorts because they have a relative amount of autonomy. And basically, you might consider this to be, let's say, an entire US style the College of Engineering under one roof. In fact, I came here from Boston University, and basically our department is about the same size as Boston University College of Engineering, except they have multiple departments with multiple chairs, and here they have just me. So as you can see, it's a fairly big job. This slide basically is designed to essentially underscore how great our academics are, how we have so many people in RE-Eng and Royal Society chairs and so on and so forth. Once again, you see the clusters shown over here. Our turnover is roughly 60 million pounds. We have a number of spin-outs. That number is not correct. It's closer to 40 or 45, depending how far back you go. So we're quite entrepreneurial, particularly in the last 10 years or so. And I'd like to point out at the very bottom, we're ranked number 2 in the world. So that's a nice sort of feather in our cap. And I think a couple of years ago, we were actually ranked number 1. This slide here is intended to provide you with a capsule view of our various research institutes. Unfortunately, I can't give you verbal descriptions of what they all do, but if you just go to the website, just Google Oxford Thermal Fluids Institute or the Oxford E-Research Center, and you'll get plenty of information about their remit in terms of the kind of research they do. And they're a critical part of the department. They form essentially the backbone, along with the panels, of our research infrastructure. This slide here shows you how subdivided we are. We have essentially 14 buildings, I should say, in 5 different sites spread out across the city, about 7,000 square meters of laboratory space in total. We're very fragmented. We can't really get around that. We'd love to be under one roof, but that's not going to happen. For example, in the case of the Institute for Biomedical Engineering, they want to be next to the Churchill Hospital. And so as a result, it makes much more sense for them to be there. So I think we're resigned to the fact that we're going to be essentially a department which is going to be distributed throughout the city, but we're trying to consolidate things to a certain extent. I'll talk about that very briefly in a minute. I do want to take advantage of the opportunity to acknowledge the philanthropic support from 2 recent awards which have come in. One is funding for 2 DPhil scholarships for students to look at how green energy can benefit communities in Africa, and the other one is funding for the Uncover Engineering Residential Program, which is a free residential course in Oxford aimed at providing 14 to 16-year-old girls with an insight into the world of engineering. They engage in hands-on activity that range from programming robots to designing and testing packaging of breakable items. I think it's a really important activity, and I'm really pleased we're engaged, and we're very, very thankful for the generosity of our donor in this particular situation. Okay, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. It's too long, other than to point out that if you want to know what our needs are, this is probably the principal slide to look at. It has to do with our estates. Our town building is decomposing. Literally, it's decomposing. I sit in my office and I see it. I see bits of the building fall by my window. So it's going to be torn down or refurbished, hopefully torn down within the next 7 or 8 years, I would think, maybe 9 years, and we're going to have to replace it. We're building a new information sciences building on the ROQ. That's a rectangular quadrangle, which would be 15,000 square meters of shared space with computer science and an nexus for the kind of interdisciplinary information and data science stuff you just heard Steve tell us about. You've already heard Malcolm talk about the Energy Systems Accelerator building, about 10,000 square meters, which will be out at Austin Mead and the home to the Energy Systems Institute. And this results in a multitude of opportunities for anybody who wants to have impact. And this is lasting impact. Named labs, lecture theaters, named conference rooms, seminar rooms, equipment facilities, and research centers are all going to be rolling around the corner as we build these buildings and help to consolidate our department a little more efficiently. We also need help with people. Named professorships are very popular and very common. A good example is the Eastman Professor. We can talk about named studentships if you like. There are opportunities there, such as the Rhodes Scholarship is a good example of that. We can talk about named postdoctoral and career development fellowships. These are an excellent way to help launch a career in engineering, science, and education. And you also have student programs that you can invest in, such as our undergraduate research opportunities program, technology clubs, such as Formula Student, sponsors, internships, and so on. Finally, we have need for help with stuff. Any good engineering department is always in need of stuff, and you could help us to procure core equipment assets that cannot easily be included in grant applications. So one example from Eleanor is the to-be named Biomedical Imaging Center, where they're looking for ultra high-speed imaging capabilities for living tissues. We talk about named research centers, another common way to achieve impact. We have a number of large research groups that could be configured as transformative centers given core funding to underpin that effort. We also have a number of early stage initiatives that require co-funding to launch. Many of these endeavor to stitch together investigators from otherwise disparate disciplines to tackle tough, multifaceted problems. And finally, needing teaching facilities are a great way to impact future generations. This could include equipment for fabrication facilities, teaching labs, and even wind tunnels and robots. I personally think our course is a bit too rooted in theory and would love to see an expansion of hands-on learning activity in the undergraduate course. What I can do is thank you all for joining us and participating in this process. I apologize for the accelerated finish, but I think I would rather hear you. I'd rather have you hear about the great things we're doing in the laboratory to listen to me talk about the department. Thank you for joining us, and unless anybody has anything to say, have a great evening, and hopefully we'll meet again soon.